Imagine living in a world where the essence of who you are, your culture, your heritage, your very identity, is systematically erased, all in the name of creating a more unified society. This was the grim reality for Afro Argentines and indigenous people in Argentina throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. As the nation pushed forward with an aggressive program of assimilation, entire communities were wiped from the historical narrative, their cultures absorbed into the dominant European framework. The story of how Argentina sought to erase these minority groups is one of the most unsettling and yet profoundly important episodes in the country's history. It is a tale of racial, cultural, and social erasure disguised as a quest for national unity. The assimilation policies in Argentina were not random acts of cruelty. They were part of a broader vision, a dream, if you will, of creating a homogeneous nation that reflected European ideals. Beginning in the mid-19th century, the Argentine government embarked on a grand social experiment. They wanted to whiten the population, to craft a national identity that mirrored the sophistication and development of European powers like Spain, Italy, and France. The country's leaders viewed European immigration as the answer. If they could flood the country with Europeans, they reasoned, they could effectively dilute the influence of Afro Argentines and indigenous people who had long been seen as inferior and obstacles to progress. Argentina's national dream rested on the belief that the European way of life, its culture, its customs, its people, was inherently superior. It was a belief that would have devastating consequences for those who did not fit the mold. The heart of Argentina's assimilation policies lay in its encouragement of European immigration. The government actively promoted and facilitated the mass arrival of Europeans, particularly from Italy and Spain, in the hope that these new arrivals would help to whiten the population. Between the mid-19th century and early 20th century, millions of Europeans flooded into Argentina, reshaping the demographic landscape and pushing the Afro-Argentine and indigenous populations to the margins of society. What was marketed as a noble effort to develop the country was, in reality, a strategic move to erase non-European identities. With each ship that docked in Buenos Aires, the cultural and demographic power of Afro-Argentines and indigenous groups diminished. These groups found themselves increasingly outnumbered and outcast in their own homeland, while European customs and values became the dominant force in the emerging national identity. For Afro-Argentines, this influx of Europeans was not just a demographic change, it was a direct assault on their place in society. The Afro-Argentine population, which had once made up a significant portion of Buenos Aires, began to disappear, both in number and in cultural visibility. Their voices were drowned out by the rising tide of European influence, and soon they would become almost invisible in the eyes of history. Assimilation is not just about demographics, it is also about culture. In Argentina, cultural suppression was one of the most effective tools used to erase the identities of Afro-Argentines and indigenous people. These groups were encouraged, sometimes forced, to abandon their own cultural practices, languages, and religious beliefs in favor of European customs. Afro-Argentines were pressured to adopt Catholicism, forsaking the African-rooted religions that had sustained them through centuries of enslavement and oppression. This was not just a passive shift, it was an active campaign of cultural erasure. Afro-Argentines were made to feel that their traditions were inferior, outdated, and even dangerous. Schools, churches, and public institutions all played a role in enforcing this cultural assimilation, and over time, many Afro-Argentines were compelled to conform to the dominant European norms in order to survive in a society that increasingly viewed them as outsiders. For indigenous people, the experience was equally traumatic. They too were encouraged to give up their languages, their spiritual practices, and their ways of life. Indigenous traditions were seen as relics of a primitive past, and those who refused to abandon them were often treated as second-class citizens. This cultural suppression was not just about forcing minority groups to conform, it was about erasing the very essence of who they were. One of the most insidious aspects of Argentina's assimilation policies was the encouragement of intermarriage between Afro Argentines, indigenous people, and European immigrants. On the surface, this might seem like a progressive policy, one that promoted unity and integration. But in reality, it was part of a deliberate effort to dilute non-European bloodlines and further the goal of racial homogenization. The government and societal elites believed that by encouraging intermarriage, they could slowly erase the African and indigenous elements of the population. Over generations, they hoped, the non-white bloodlines would become so intermixed with European ones that they would effectively disappear. Afro Argentines in particular were seen as a population that could be whitened through this process of intermarriage. This was not just about race, it was about identity. By promoting intermarriage, the government was seeking to erase the cultural and racial distinctiveness of Afro Argentines and indigenous people. And in many cases, it worked. Over time, the lines between these groups and the European-descended population blurred, and the distinct identities of Afro Argentines and indigenous people were increasingly subsumed into the broader Argentine population. As if cultural suppression and demographic engineering weren't enough, Argentina's Afro-Argentine population was also devastated by the country's numerous wars and conflicts. During the War of Independence and the subsequent internal conflicts, many Afro-Argentine men were enlisted to fight. While serving in the military, these men faced harsh conditions, and high mortality rates from both combat and disease disproportionately affected the Afro-Argentine community. The government knew what it was doing. By sending large numbers of Afro-Argentine men to the front lines, they were not just fighting wars, they were actively reducing the Afro-Argentine population. The high death tolls from these wars contributed significantly to the decline of the Afro-Argentine community, which had already been weakened by assimilation policies and cultural suppression. The military became a tool of demographic change. Afro-Argentine men who might have otherwise gone on to contribute to their communities were instead lost to the ravages of war. And in their absence, the Afro-Argentine population continued to shrink, furthering the government's goal of creating a more homogeneous Eurocentric society. As Argentina modernized and urbanized, the Afro-Argentine community faced yet another challenge: displacement. Cities like Buenos Aires expanded rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and many Afro-Argentine communities were pushed out of their traditional neighborhoods. The forces of urbanization and modernization swept through the city, displacing Afro-Argentines and further erasing their presence from the national consciousness. As they were pushed out of urban centers, Afro-Argentines lost not only their homes but also their cultural and communal ties. Over time, many Afro-Argentines were absorbed into the broader population, and their distinct identity became increasingly invisible. The myth of Argentina as a white nation took hold, and the contributions of Afro-Argentines to the country's history and culture were all but forgotten. Today, when people think of Argentina, they often imagine a nation of European descent, a country whose culture and history are rooted in the traditions of Spain, Italy, and France. This image is no accident. It is the result of a deliberate, centuries-long effort to erase the presence and contributions of Afro-Argentines and indigenous people from the national narrative. The myth of a white Argentina is a powerful one, but it is also a false one. The Afro-Argentine community played a crucial role in shaping the country's history, from the colonial era to the present day. They fought in the wars of independence, contributed to the country's economic development, and enriched its cultural landscape. Yet, due to the aggressive assimilation policies of the 19th and 20th centuries, their story has been largely forgotten. But history, as they say, is written by the victors. And in Argentina, the victors were those who sought to create a Eurocentric nation, one that denied the existence of its African and indigenous roots. The result is a national narrative that erases the contributions of Afro-Argentines and indigenous people, rendering them invisible in the story of Argentina's development. The story of Argentina's assimilation policies is not just a story of demographic change, it is a story of cultural erasure, of the systematic destruction of identities that did not fit the Eurocentric vision of the nation's leaders. It is a story of a population that was marginalized, suppressed, and ultimately erased from the historical narrative. But the Afro-Argentine experience is not one that should be forgotten. It is a vital part of Argentina's history, one that deserves to be reclaimed and remembered. The myth of a white Argentina may persist, but the truth is that the country's heritage is far more complex and far richer than that myth allows. By telling the story of Afro-Argentines and the policies that sought to erase them, we can begin to reclaim a part of history that has been hidden for far too long.